Hello, welcome back to another video. This week, I completed my second set of studies on Arch's cold pressed paper, talked about how to modify references, and gave some tips on expanding your comfort zone. Let's get started. The supplies I used include Arch's cold pressed watercolor paper, Faber-Castell's 12 set of Polychromos color pencils, a white Gellyroll gel pen, Daniel Smith's Watercolor Essentials set, Pebeo Studio Gouache in permanent white, Sable hair brushes in sizes 6 and 11, a Sumi Ink Brush, and a plastic mixing palette. All supplies are listed in the description below. Like always, I started by transferring my sketches onto the watercolor paper using a light box. I started with a close-up photo first, but I've grouped all the steps together to make it easier to understand. This is going to be a theory-focused video, but if you're interested in the nitty-gritty process details, feel free to check out the other videos in my Draw With Me playlist. Anyway, my first painting step was to establish the lightest areas and color temperatures with an initial wash. I did this in a few studies in the past, but I stopped several months back and switched to color blocking individual objects. I felt like I had more water control working in smaller areas, and it made me feel more efficient. Since switching to cold pressed cotton paper though, water control has been easier, so I'm trying out more techniques. I'm glad I did this for these studies. This underpainting of sorts helps unify the colors I layered over it and gave me a clear idea of cool versus warm areas of the color composition. Speaking of composition, I think I might have finally started grasping how watercolorists view references. Instead of thinking of shadows as part of discrete objects, I group them together and let them blend into larger shapes. This is best illustrated in the background establishing shot. In the past, I would have worked on the background, midground, and foreground separately, but I let the shadows bleed into each other here. It was freeing working this way, and made me appreciate watercolor's strengths. After these initial layers, I started working on the medium shapes. I try to think in big, then medium, and finally small shapes and details in my work. This prevents me from over-detailing before the values and big picture are firmly established. In these studies, this meant working on the overall forms of the dresses, skin, and hair to create a sense of volume first. I think my favorite part of these studies were the white dress and shirt. White is such an interesting color to work with. It picks up on all the colors around it, which means that shadows and midtones run the whole gambit, from cool to warm, depending on how the light is hitting the fabric. A couple months ago, I wouldn't have been able to capture these shifts in color, but I'm happy I took the time to layer light washes to create the hues I saw this time. However, as satisfying as these middle layers are, they can sometimes make me nervous. When I work digitally, I have much more edge control, so things don't muddle together. When I first started with watercolor, I hated how things blurred and melted together as the line work gradually disappeared under darker washes. Now, I know not to panic. I can always reinforce necessary lines and pick out the most important plane changes later. The hands and hair look muddy at this stage in both studies, but I'm not focused on that. Instead, I'm thinking about value and color. Are the darks dark enough? Do the colors match the rest of the scene in my reference? If the answer to those questions is yes, then I know this phase is successful. From this point, my goal is to zoom in on the focal points and bring up the level of detail in these areas. Let's take a brief detour into storytelling as this footage plays out. When I first found this set of photos, I was immediately drawn to the story I glimpsed in several of the shots. It was a soft, romantic moment that I wanted to capture. I initially only planned to use a close-up shot as the study, but I kept on thinking about the other photos and eventually decided to include them. After making this decision, I had to figure out how to best tell the story. I wanted an establishing shot to show where they were, then a medium shot focusing in on the gift, and then the reaction in a close-up. Luckily, I only had to make minor adjustments this time to capture my vision that mostly involved cropping and moving elements around. Don't be afraid to change your reference if you think a different arrangement will tell a better story or work better as an overall composition. Anyway, it's time for the final details in gouache and pencil. I want to give a few tips on stepping outside your comfort zone. This is the first time I've done a series of images for one of these Draw With Me videos. I've been mostly focused on portraits before this, but I wanted to try something new. Of course, pushing past what you're comfortable with isn't easy. The reason I was able to do this is because I only took a few steps this time. The materials were familiar to me, as were the subjects, which were people and nature. I originally planned to do the establishing shot with the Cotman watercolors to compare them to the Daniel Smith watercolors, but I decided not to. It wouldn't be a fair comparison with different subjects, and I wanted to focus on capturing the story instead of how the materials compared. Setting limits might feel restrictive, but it also raises your chances of success, which should hopefully encourage you to try again next time. The other tip I want to mention is to let go of your expectations. I wanted to learn, not to create the best studies I've ever done. Focusing on growth instead of results gave me permission to try techniques like the loose first wash and discover new ways of looking at things. Here are the final studies. Overall, I'm happy with this experience, and I hope you learned something from it too, or at least enjoyed the process. As always, I hope you create something that brings you joy this week, and I'll see you next week with the Daniel Smith versus Cotman video. Bye!